What if the man you embarrassed in first class was the one who could ground your plane and your career in seconds? The morning air in Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport carried that mix of burnt coffee and jet fuel, a scent most travelers ignored, but for Darius Holt, it always meant movement, progress. He'd flown more miles than he could count, but this trip was supposed to be different. No meetings, no investors, just 5 quiet hours of peace before another wave of work. At 42, Darius didn't look like the kind of man who ran a national logistics company. He didn't wear custom suits or gold watches. Today, it was a navy polo, gray blazer, jeans, and worn leather shoes that told their own story. He'd built his business, Holt Integrated Systems, from the ground up. One late night, one setback, one delivery at a time. As he sat near gate C7, scrolling through a few last emails, he caught a few curious glances. It wasn't unusual. People often assumed he was staff, IT maybe, or a consultant. No one ever guessed he was the CEO whose company handled over 60% of Skyway Airline's cargo routing and ground coordination across the country, but Darius preferred it that way. He'd learned long ago that true power rarely needs to announce itself. The boarding announcement echoed, "Skyway Flight 214 to Los Angeles. First class and priority boarding now." Darius stood, collected his carry-on, and walked forward. The gate agent scanned his phone. "Good morning, Mr. Holt," she said with a polite smile. "Seat 2A. Enjoy your flight." He thanked her, stepped onto the jet bridge, and felt the air turn cooler. Inside the plane, a few passengers were already settling in. First class wasn't full. A couple in matching travel pillows, an older man reading a newspaper, and a woman tapping away on a tablet. Darius placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down in 2A, and exhaled. Finally, no phone calls, no meetings, just peace. He looked out the window as the morning light stretched over the runway. Somewhere out there, planes were lifting into the sky, carrying stories, lives, and moments that would never repeat. He loved that about flying, how everyone shared the same space but came from different worlds. A flight attendant passed by, smiling. "Can I get you something before we take off, sir?" "Just water, please." "Of course." Darius leaned back, loosening his shoulders. His assistant, Janelle, had triple-checked everything. The presentation waiting in Los Angeles, the hotel, even his driver's name. He trusted her like family. She'd been there from the start, back when his office was a rented room behind a car wash. He checked his phone one last time. A message from her blinked at the top. "All set for the LA meeting. Rest up. You've earned it." He smiled faintly. Maybe he had. But just as he began to relax, a shadow crossed his aisle. A man in a pilot's uniform stood there, tall, sharp features, early 40s. The white shirt and gold-striped epaulets gave him authority, the kind that drew instant attention. He looked down at Darius with a slight frown. "That's my seat," the man said, his tone firm, certain. Darius looked up, puzzled. "Excuse me?" "Seat 2A. That's where I'm supposed to be." The cabin seemed to pause for half a second. The woman on the tablet looked up briefly. The flight attendant froze mid-step. Darius blinked, then checked his phone. "Boarding pass. 2A. Confirmed. Paid. Assigned." "This is my seat," he said calmly, showing him the screen. The pilot's name tag read E. Callahan, Evan Callahan, First Officer. He stared at the phone, then at Darius. "There must be some mistake." Darius's voice stayed even. "There's no mistake. This is my seat." The air around them grew still. Evan glanced at the flight attendant, who avoided eye contact, but something in the pilot's expression said this wasn't about a seat at all. The hum of boarding hadn't yet faded when the tension in row 2 thickened. Passengers filed past, unaware that the story of this flight had already begun before the plane even left the gate. The flight attendant, a young woman named Hannah McClure, stepped forward, her polite smile strained. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice light but nervous. Evan Callahan shifted his stance, crossing his arms. "There's been a seat assignment error. 2A should be reserved for crew repositioning." Darius turned toward her, patient but firm. "My boarding pass says 2A. I booked it 3 weeks ago. If there's an issue, I'd like it resolved before takeoff." Hannah looked at the pass, then at the pilot. First Officer Callahan, I don't see a crew note for 2A on my list. Evan frowned. Check again. It was cleared this morning. Behind them, a few first-class passengers exchanged quiet looks. The woman with the tablet slipped out one earbud, pretending to check her phone while recording. The older man with the newspaper peeked over the top of his page. Darius could feel every eye drifting toward him, not because he was loud or confrontational, but because he was there, calm, collected, confident. I'm sure it's just a mix-up, Darius said evenly. Let's get it sorted. Evan's jaw tightened. Look, sir, this seat was reserved for crew purposes. You can move to another available seat in the main cabin until we sort it out. Darius raised an eyebrow. You want me to move to economy because of a system error that isn't mine? That's correct, Evan replied, his tone clipped. Hannah swallowed hard. Mr. Callahan, maybe we should double-check before asking a passenger to... I said, move him to economy for now, Evan interrupted. The words carried the weight of authority, but they landed wrong, especially with how he said him. Darius inhaled slowly. He wasn't a man who liked conflict, but he'd spent his entire career walking a fine line between composure and pride. He'd been in boardrooms where people mistook him for an assistant. He'd been ignored in meetings until he spoke, and the room went silent. But this, being told in front of strangers that he didn't belong where he'd paid to sit, cut deeper than most things did. Hannah took a step back, glancing between the two men. Sir, would you mind waiting just a moment while I speak with the gate? Darius nodded once. Of course. Evan exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed. He turned and muttered something under his breath, too low for most to hear. But Darius caught it. Always something. The words weren't loud, but they burned. Darius sat still, fingers pressed lightly against his phone screen. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Just disappointed. A middle-aged passenger in seat 3B leaned forward slightly. Hey man, don't let it bother you. These things happen all the time, he whispered. Darius turned his head, meeting his eyes. Do they? The man blinked, then sank back into his seat. Hannah returned a moment later, tablet in hand. Mr. Holt, I confirmed your booking. Seat 2A is yours. Darius nodded. Thank you. Evan's expression didn't change. There must be a system issue. I'll handle it after departure. But the moment had already shifted. The calm in first class had curdled into awkward silence. Hannah moved to prepare for takeoff, passengers avoided eye contact, and Evan stood just long enough to make sure Darius knew this wasn't over. But what no one knew, not yet, was that Darius Holt never argued twice. When he stayed quiet, something far bigger was already in motion. The seatbelt sign hadn't even come on yet, and already the air in first class felt heavy. You could almost sense it, that mix of politeness and judgment people wear when they're pretending nothing's wrong. Evan Callahan remained near the galley, whispering something to a senior attendant. Darius could tell from the sideways glances that the discussion wasn't about flight safety. He stayed composed, hands folded neatly over his phone, his carry-on tucked under the seat. Finally, Evan returned, this time without the calm tone. Sir, he said, we've verified the booking, but this seat is prioritized for operational staff. I'll need you to relocate so we can prepare for takeoff. Darius looked up, steady. Operational staff? You mean you? Evan's jaw twitched. Yes, it's for repositioning crew, which means your company overbooked, Darius cut in softly. That's not my responsibility. Evan didn't expect him to interrupt. His brows lifted slightly, a flash of irritation crossing his face. Look, I'm not trying to make a big deal out of this. Just move to an open seat in the back, and I'll make sure you're compensated. Compensated? Darius repeated slowly, almost as if tasting the word. Do you even hear how that sounds? The pilot exhaled through his nose. Sir, please. I'm asking politely. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Darius leaned back in his seat, silent for a few seconds. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just looked at Evan. Really looked at him. The confidence in that gaze wasn't arrogance. It was something deeper. It came from years of having to earn respect in rooms where no one gave it freely. Then, quietly, I paid for this seat, Mr. Callahan. I'll stay right here. A murmur moved through the cabin, phones angled discreetly toward the aisle. The woman with the tablet now recorded openly. Hannah appeared again, trying to mediate. Gentlemen, please. We can resolve this calmly, Evan gestured toward Darius. Then ask him to cooperate. Darius smiled faintly. I already am. The pilot's patience cracked. Sir, if you continue to refuse instructions, I'll have to request security assistance. That word, security, hit like a spark in dry grass. Several passengers looked up sharply, their expressions changing. Security? Darius repeated. For sitting in my assigned seat? Evan didn't respond. He just motioned toward Hannah. Please contact the gate. Hannah froze, her eyes darting between them. Sir, are you sure? Do it, he said. A hush fell over first class. Darius could hear the faint sound of the cabin door still open, ground staff talking outside, the sound of a child laughing from coach. It was strange, how in moments like this, the world seemed both smaller and louder. He took a slow breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. One short message to Janelle, his assistant, waited in drafts. He'd typed it earlier that morning, half-jokingly, in case something went wrong during travel. It said, if Skyway ever disrespects one of our team members, or me personally, terminate all contracts immediately. Now he edited it down to 6 words. Pull our contract with Skyway Airlines. He hesitated for half a second, not out of anger, but certainty, and then added 2 more. Effective immediately. He hit send. The phone screen dimmed. Darius placed it face down on the armrest and looked up just as a uniformed airport agent appeared at the door. Sir, the agent said quietly, we've been asked to speak with you about your seat assignment. Darius stood up slowly, calm as ever. Of course. Let's talk outside. As he stepped into the aisle, passengers watched silently. Some sympathetic, some curious, and some, the kind who always believed authority over reason, simply relieved it wasn't them. But for Evan Callahan, that brief walk down the aisle would mark the start of the longest 14 minutes of his career. When Darius stepped into the jet bridge, the sudden drop in noise felt like a release. No more whispers, no more staring eyes. Just the cold, metallic echo of the walkway and the quiet murmur of 2 gate agents, unsure what to do next. The lead agent, a woman with short auburn hair and a badge that read R. Jameson, spoke first. Mr. Holt, I'm so sorry for the confusion. Can you tell me what happened? Darius's tone never wavered. Your first officer believes I shouldn't be in my assigned seat. Jameson frowned. We have you clearly booked in 2A. I don't understand. Neither do I, he replied, glancing back through the open cabin door, where Evan still stood stiffly at the bulkhead, arms folded like a guard. Hannah, the flight attendant, hovered behind him, her posture tense. He's saying it's for crew repositioning, she said quietly. Jameson shook her head. There's no crew note for that. None. Darius folded his hands together. Then maybe you should ask him why he insisted otherwise. Jameson nodded and walked up the ramp, leaving Darius to wait by the door. A few passengers peeked through the curtain, the kind of onlookers who claimed to hate drama but couldn't turn away from it. Evan's voice carried faintly down the jet bridge. We have procedures, Rachel. Crew rotation always gets priority. And yet, Jameson said firmly, there's no record of any request. The passenger had this seat confirmed. Evan didn't reply. He turned toward the cabin instead, as if retreating into his authority would make the situation vanish. When Jameson returned, she sighed. Mr. Holt, I'll make sure this is corrected. Would you like to continue on this flight or wait for another? Darius studied her face. She meant well, but the fatigue in her eyes told him what he already knew. This wasn't the first time she'd had to clean up someone else's arrogance. I'll stay, he said, but I'll take a seat in economy. Sir, you don't have to do that. I know, he said softly. I'm choosing to. He took his carry-on, walked back through the cabin. Every head turned as he passed. The air in first class had gone stale, thick with quiet embarrassment. The man in 3B who'd told him not to let it bother you couldn't even look up. The woman with the tablet hit stop recording as if erasing her guilt. Evan pretended to check his watch. Darius paused by his seat, looked at him, and said only 2 words. Calm, measured, absolute. Enjoy it. Then he kept walking. Down the aisle, past rows of faces pretending to be distracted. Past the curtain, where the chatter of coach passengers filled the space again. He found an empty seat near the back, tucked his bag beneath the chair, and settled in. For the first time that morning, he smiled. Not out of joy, but understanding. Some lessons aren't taught in boardrooms. They're taught right in front of people who think you have nothing to teach them. Meanwhile, up front, Evan Callahan returned to the cockpit. He straightened his tie, checking his reflection in the darkened windshield. The captain beside him, an older man named Tom Rayner, glanced over. "You good, Callahan?" "Yeah," Evan said curtly. "Just a seating mix-up." Rayner grunted. "All right, let's get clearance." But when he radioed ground control, the reply wasn't what either man expected. "Hold position, Sky, way 214. Operations just flagged an internal request. Stand by." Rayner frowned. "Internal? What kind?" The controller's tone was clipped. "Network-wide hold. Company systems are locking. Sit tight." Evan looked up sharply. "What do you mean, locking?" Rayner shrugged. "Means something just broke. Or someone broke it." But 14 minutes later, Evan Callahan would realize that the man he pushed out of first class wasn't just another passenger. He was the one person who could stop every Skyway flight in the air. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for departure, but the plane didn't move. The low chatter of restless passengers began to ripple through the aisles. Some were already checking their watches, others glancing toward the window for any sign of movement. But nothing. The plane stayed parked. Darius sat quietly in seat 24C in the middle of the economy section. He didn't mind the cramped space, not after everything. The hum of voices around him was oddly comforting. No one here knew who he was, and for once, he was fine with that. His phone buzzed softly against the tray table. It was a message from Janelle. Done, confirmed, contract termination filed. He read it once, then again, then locked the screen. He wasn't angry. That emotion had left him the moment he stepped into coach. This was business, not revenge. His company's systems handled cargo logistics, fuel scheduling, maintenance routing, and flight equipment tracking for Skyway Airlines. Without his team's network running in the background, their entire operation would grind to a halt. And it just had. Across the intercom, Hannah's voice broke the uneasy quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a short delay due to a systems issue. We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." A few passengers groaned. Someone muttered something about tech problems. Darius simply closed his eyes. Up front, though, tension was mounting fast. Captain Rayner leaned toward the instrument panel, tapping buttons that didn't respond. "Nav uplinks down. We're not getting our flight plan data." Evan frowned. "That's impossible." "These systems are centralized." "Yeah, and apparently offline," Rayner said. "Dispatch says every Skyway aircraft is holding. They're blind across the network." Evan stared. "Every aircraft?" Rayner nodded grimly. "Yep, whole system went dark about 10 minutes ago. Some kind of logistics freeze." That word hit Evan hard. Logistics. He remembered the man in 2A, calm, sharp, confident. Logistics. He could almost see Darius's face again, the quiet way he'd said, "Enjoy it." Hannah poked her head into the cockpit. "Captain, passengers are starting to get restless." "Do we have an ETA?" Rayner sighed. "Tell them it's a system outage. We can't move until corporate clears it." Evan leaned back in his seat, staring blankly at the windshield. His confidence, the steady sense of control he always carried, started to slip. "Did they say what caused it?" he asked quietly. Rayner shook his head. "They're still figuring it out." Something to do with ground coordination. One of their main logistics providers just suspended service. That sentence landed like a punch. Evan's stomach turned. "Who?" Rayner squinted at the message coming through on the comms tablet. "A company called Holt Integrated Systems." Evan froze. Rayner kept reading. "CEO's name, Darius Holt." Evan's mouth went dry. "You're kidding." "Nope," Rayner said, oblivious to his co-pilot's expression. "Apparently this guy's company runs all our back-end freight tracking. Without them, we can't schedule fuel loads, cargo transfers, nothing. We're grounded until further notice." Evan's heart hammered. His throat tightened, his pulse picking up speed. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes on the darkened runway lights outside. The silence between him and the captain said everything. Back in 24C, Darius turned his phone face up again. A final text from Janelle had arrived. "Ground control confirmed. All Skyway flights are paused." He typed back one line. "Let it sit. 14 minutes only." Then he looked out the small oval window beside him. The airport lights flickered against the night sky. Somewhere up front, he imagined the pilot finally realizing the cost of arrogance. But this wasn't about power, it was about principle, and Darius believed in teaching lessons quietly, the kind people remember forever. The passengers didn't know what was happening, only that it was taking too long. 20 minutes had passed, and the plane hadn't moved an inch. The seatbelt sign was still off, the air conditioning ran low, and conversations had turned from mild curiosity to open frustration. In first class, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The man with the newspaper had stopped pretending to read. The woman with the tablet kept checking the time, muttering to herself. Evan Callahan sat stiff in the cockpit, one leg bouncing under the console. Dispatch says the logistics freeze started at 8:42, Captain Rayner muttered, scrolling through updates. Cargo routing, ground scheduling, even the maintenance queues, all down. No fuel requests are being approved. Nothing. Evan's voice came out lower than before. And it started right after boarding? Rayner looked over. You're thinking this is connected to that passenger? Evan didn't answer, but his silence said plenty. The captain sighed. Son, people like that don't have that kind of pull. Evan swallowed hard. Maybe you're right. But he knew he wasn't. Meanwhile, back in row 24, Darius checked his watch. It had been exactly 14 minutes since his message to Janelle. Around him, people were getting impatient. One man loudly called for an update. Another groaned about missing a meeting in LA. Darius sat quietly, hands resting on his knees. He wasn't smug. He wasn't gloating. He simply waited. He thought of the years it had taken to get here. Not just success, but peace. He remembered the faces of investors who hadn't believed in him, the long nights working with a single laptop, and the people who assumed that calm meant weakness. But calm, he'd learned, was power under control. Up front, Hannah's voice broke through again on the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We're waiting on clearance from operations. We'll update you as soon as we have more information. The murmurs grew louder. Rayner leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. This doesn't make sense. They're saying Holt Systems flagged Skyway's account as non-operational. That can't be right. Evan didn't move. Non-operational means shut off, he said quietly. It means every system they control has gone dark. Rayner turned toward him. And how the hell would you know that? Evan's mouth opened, then closed again. He stared straight ahead. Hannah peeked into the cockpit again, her tone cautious. Captain, a passenger and coach, seat 24C, asked if we'll be leaving soon. He says he's connecting in L.A. Rayner nodded absently. Tell him we're working on it. But Evan's head snapped toward her. Did you say 24 degrees Celsius? She blinked. Yes, why? He didn't answer, just turned his gaze to the cabin door, eyes narrowing slightly. Out in the aisle, Darius looked calm as ever. He sipped the small cup of water a flight attendant had brought him earlier. The delay didn't seem to bother him. If anything, he looked like a man waiting for a meeting to end. Then, suddenly, a chime from the intercom interrupted the murmurs. Attention all Skyway crews. Please maintain current gate position. Do not initiate taxi. Company directive pending. Rayner frowned. That's a system-wide broadcast. They never do that mid-boarding. Evan exhaled, whispering almost to himself. He did it. Rayner turned sharply. What did you say? Evan looked at the captain, the realization heavy in his voice now. That man, the one from 2A, he's not just a passenger. He's the CEO of Holt Integrated Systems. Rayner stared. You mean the same company that... Yeah, Evan said quietly. That's the one. The captain leaned back in disbelief, a low whistle leaving his lips. Well, he muttered, looks like you just told the wrong man to move. Evan closed his eyes, his pulse thudding in his ears. He could still see Darius's expression, calm, measured, not a trace of anger. Just that look that said you'll understand soon. But the worst part wasn't that the plane was grounded. It was knowing exactly who had grounded it, and why. The cabin had gone silent. That awkward kind of silence where even the air felt heavy. Every passenger sensed something serious was happening, even if they didn't know what. A baby cried in the distance. A man coughed twice. The rest was tension you could almost taste. Captain Rayner finally unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the cockpit door open. He gestured for Hannah to follow him down the aisle. They stopped a few rows short of Coach. "Find this Darius Holt," Rayner murmured. "If he's who Callahan says he is, we need to talk to him, now." Hannah nodded and made her way toward the back, her shoes clicking softly on the carpet. She found Darius sitting calmly, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as she approached. "Mr. Holt?" "Yes," he replied simply. "Captain Rayner would like a word, sir." Darius gave a polite nod, stood, and followed her back through the cabin. Passengers leaned into the aisle, whispering. No one knew what was going on, but the man who'd been moved from first class was now walking back toward it, escorted by crew. That was enough to spark 100 stories. When Darius reached the cockpit door, Rayner stepped aside to let him in. Evan sat stiffly in his seat, hands folded, eyes on the floor. "Mr. Holt," Rayner began, "I just received word from our corporate office that your company's systems are currently offline. I assume that was intentional?" Darius didn't blink. "It was a compliance measure," he said evenly, "triggered when your staff violated a professional conduct clause in our partnership contract." Rayner's eyes widened. "Triggered? As in automatic?" "No," Darius said, "as in immediate." Evan shifted, finally finding his voice. "Mr. Holt, look, I didn't know who you were. It wasn't personal. I thought—" Darius raised a hand, cutting him off. "You thought I didn't belong in that seat." The silence that followed was brutal. Evan swallowed hard. "I was following what I believed were company procedures. Crew priority." "That's not what you said," Darius interrupted softly. "You said there must be a mistake. And then you implied I should move to avoid a scene." Evan looked down, his voice small. "I made a judgment call." "Yes," Darius replied, "you did. And it told me everything I needed to know about how your company treats people who don't fit their idea of belonging." Rayner cleared his throat, trying to calm the growing tension. "Mr. Holt, with respect, the situation's escalating beyond our control. The entire airline is stalled." Darius looked at him. "It'll resume soon. 14 minutes, to be exact. That's long enough to make a point, but not long enough to destroy what we've built together." Rayner nodded slowly. "You're sending a message." Darius's tone didn't change. "I'm reminding your people that respect costs nothing, but disrespect can cost everything." For the first time since the incident began, Evan looked him in the eyes. There was no defiance left, no hint of superiority, just guilt and realization. "You could have embarrassed me publicly," he said quietly. "You could have made this a headline." Darius gave a faint smile. "That's not my goal. I don't need to humiliate you to teach you. I just need you to remember me the next time you think someone doesn't belong where they earned the right to be." The cockpit fell quiet again. The captain's radio buzzed faintly with updates, systems slowly returning to normal. The delay was almost over. Darius turned to leave. As he reached the cabin door, he paused and looked back at Evan. "You fly planes for a living. You should know better than anyone. Altitude doesn't make you superior. It just gives you perspective." He walked back down the aisle, each step measured and calm. Passengers watched him pass, most not knowing the details, but feeling the shift. Something about the way he carried himself, the quiet power of someone who'd just changed everything without raising his voice. Evan sat there, replaying the words over and over. Altitude doesn't make you superior. He couldn't shake it. But what stayed with him even more was the way Darius had left. No anger, no gloating, just a calm dignity that stripped every excuse bare. By the time Skyway Flight 214 finally rolled away from the gate, the sun had climbed high over the Arizona desert. The delay, officially logged as temporary systems malfunction, had lasted exactly 14 minutes. Nothing more, nothing less. To the average passenger, it was just another frustrating delay. To Evan Callahan, it was a lifetime compressed into a quarter of an hour. He hadn't spoken a word since Darius left the cockpit. The captain didn't press him. Sometimes silence was the best punishment. He just followed procedure, waiting for clearance, running through his checklist, while Evan sat staring at the controls that suddenly felt like they weighed a ton. Down in 24 degrees Celsius, Darius sat quietly, looking out the window as the aircraft began to taxi. The world outside was bright and almost blinding, runways stretching like silver ribbons across the desert floor. He wasn't angry anymore, and truthfully, he hadn't been for a while. What he felt instead was a kind of calm acceptance, the kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing, even if no one applauded you for it. The flight attendant came by with a smile that looked more genuine than before. "Mr. Holt," she said softly, "the captain wanted me to offer you your original seat back." Darius looked up at her, thoughtful. "That won't be necessary. I'm fine right here," she nodded. "Understood." Then after a pause, she added, "For what it's worth, I saw what happened, and I'm sorry." He offered a small nod. "Thank you. Just remember, how you treat people matters, especially when no one's watching." She hesitated, then said quietly, "I'll remember that," before moving on. As the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, Darius exhaled slowly. He thought about his father, a delivery driver who used to tell him, "Son, the day you start believing you're less than anyone else, you've already lost." That voice, decades old now, still guided him through moments like this. Up front, Evan finally broke his silence. "Captain," he said, "I made a mistake." Rayner kept his eyes on the sky ahead. "You did," he said simply, "but you're lucky. You got a chance to see it before it cost you more than your pride." Evan nodded. He didn't even raise his voice. "That's what real authority looks like," Rayner replied. "It doesn't need volume. It has weight." They flew in silence for a while. Evan stared out the small window beside him, watching the horizon widen. The same altitude that had once made him feel powerful now felt humbling. He thought about every time he dismissed someone, the passengers who looked out of place in first class, the crew members he'd spoken down to, the people whose value he measured too quickly. It was strange, he thought, how one quiet man could change the way you see the entire sky. Halfway through the flight, Evan sent a message through the airline's internal system, a formal apology addressed directly to Darius Holt. It wasn't long or elaborate, just 6 words that carried everything he couldn't say aloud. "I was wrong. I've learned my lesson." He didn't know if Darius would read it, but he sent it anyway. When the plane touched down in Los Angeles, passengers clapped out of habit, grateful to finally land. Darius waited until the cabin cleared before standing. As he reached the front, Evan stepped out of the cockpit, his voice low. "Mr. Holt," he said, "for what it's worth, I'm sorry." Darius looked at him for a long moment, then extended a hand. "Do better. That's all I ask." Evan shook it, eyes lowered. Darius turned, walked down the jet bridge, and disappeared into the crowd. Just another traveler among many. But the story of that flight wouldn't fade. Within hours, whispers spread through Skyway's internal network about what had happened. About the CEO who'd grounded an airline, not out of spite, but out of principle. And somewhere, in an office full of glowing monitors, Janelle smiled as the systems came back online, right on schedule. Because sometimes, the strongest message doesn't come from shouting. It comes from silence that makes the world stop just long enough to listen. Respect isn't earned by titles, uniforms, or wealth. It's earned by how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us. Don't judge someone by where they sit, what they wear, or what you assume they are. You never know who you're talking to, or how much power kindness truly holds. If this story moved you, take a second to reflect, then share it. Someone out there might need the reminder today.